Okay. So I think at this stage we can start our webinar. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to today's Open Nuclear Network webinar, Escalation in the Middle East, Are Nuclear Risks Rising? My name is Ksenia Bernavska, and I'm the Engagement and Network Specialist at Open Nuclear Network, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. ONN, Open Nuclear Network, is an international NGO based in Vienna and a program of American foundation Pax Sapiens, a foundation committed to preventing predictable global catastrophes. At ONN, we're specifically focusing on nuclear risk reduction, and we apply open source analysis, forecasting methodologies, and engagement of impact-capable networks to reduce nuclear risks and support timely and evidence-based decision-making when it comes to nuclear risk reduction. Today's discussion is part of ONN's new webinar series, which is called So What webinar series, where we move beyond the headlines and trying to unpack what developments actually mean for the nuclear risks and what can be done to reduce them. In light of the recent escalation in the Middle East, we've convened this urgent conversation to examine what these developments could mean for Iran's nuclear trajectory, the broader non-proliferation regime, and the risk landscape over the coming months. Earlier this year, on 27th of January, if I'm precise, ONN's expert roster, as part of the Project Loop, assessed the probability of US and Israeli strikes on Iran at roughly 40%. With events now unfolding, today's discussion will reflect on that forecast and explore what nuclear risks may now be increasing or decreasing, what scenarios could plausibly emerge over the next 6 to 12 months, and what practical steps might help to reduce nuclear risks in the near term. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by three distinguished experts who will be the leaders of this discussion. And I'll be sharing kind of their shorter bias, but we will have their longer bias in the chat. So you're very welcome to go and read them in the chat section. So first, we have Associate Professor Dr. Şebnem Udum. She's a faculty member in the Department of International Relations in Hacettepe University in Ankara, Turkey. She's been doing research on the missile proliferation in the Middle East, on the nuclear energy debate in Turkey. She's affiliated with the International Atomic Energy Agency International Nuclear Security Education Network since 2013, where she also served as a network chair. Her research includes nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear energy, nuclear security, energy security, and Turkish foreign and security policy. And she is also a member of ONN's expert roster, which we're very proud of. The next speaker here, we also joined by one and only Bob Einhorn, a senior fellow in the Center for Security Strategy and Technology within the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining Brookings in 2013, he had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Department of State, most recently as the Special Advisor for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control. He also served as an Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. And we are also proud to say that Bob Einhorn is a member of ONN's Advisory Council, and we're very happy to have been working with him for over these years. Last but not least, we are joined by Karim Kamel, ONN's Foresight and Prediction Specialist, who leads Foresight and Prediction initiatives at ONN. He's also a junior researcher at the Peace Research Center Prague at Charles University, where his doctoral research examines the epistemic community surrounding the use of Delphi methods in the technology policy. Before joining ONN, Karim worked at the CTBTO, at the Social Science Research Council, and at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So with all these amazing and distinguished speakers, I'm very happy to begin this discussion. We will have a discussion section for the larger part of the event, and then at the end we will have 10 to 15 minutes to have an audience Q&A. So if you have a question to our speakers, please use the Q&A function and leave your question there so we can address it at the end of the webinar. And we'll begin this discussion with Karim, who will briefly walk us through ONN's earlier forecast that I mentioned before and the indicators behind it, before turning to the rest of the panelists to explore the escalation, how the escalation may be affecting the nuclear risk. Thank you again all for joining this timely discussion today, and let's begin. So Karim, ONN and ONN expert roster forecasted a roughly 40% probability of strikes on Iran. What indicators drove that assessment, and what did we think would follow if strikes occurred? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ksenia, and pleasure to be here with everyone. So like you noted, we had 40% aggregate prediction that included 52 experts that took part in this forecasting exercise. I have divided the main arguments that came from the chat and from the discussion that we had during the workshop, the forecasting workshop, into two parts. First are movements, and second are repercussions. So I'll mention four on movements. People said that Venezuela provides an inspiration. Second thing is we had been seeing movements, namely of assets, including the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier into the region. Third, we were seeing narrative building by Trump and Netanyahu in the region about the imminence of the strike. And then fourth, people were referencing the national defense strategy where the conflict in the Middle East is framed as an opportunity. On the repercussion side, why people thought a strike would happen is one, whatever Israel does, it won't spill over to another great power, namely China or Russia. Second, it would rally people around the regime in Israel. Third, it would not rally people around the regime in Iran. In fact, experts saw that when this happens, people are going to be dispersed from around the regime. And then finally, it could also provide a diversion from the issues of the Epstein file. So these basically a summation of all the arguments that were presented why a strike could happen. Quickly, why a strike wouldn't happen, since we actually forecasted more that a strike is not likely to happen, but it ended up happening, is the element of surprise is lost. And then the nuclear threshold status of Iran is gone. Negotiations are ongoing. Neighboring countries are against the strike. And Iran has been able to extinguish the protests that happened the month before. And now the IRGC is more cohesive and has a more strong grip on internal matters in Iran. And then finally, Trump is against a prolonged war of attrition, but would only go into a war that is short and decisive. Now, the context also for this is at that time, not just ONN, but the entire market of prediction was on the decline. At some point earlier, when the protests reached its highest, we saw the markets getting closer to 90% likelihood that a strike would happen before February 28. By the time we had our workshop and discussion and we're discussing these questions, the market was actually more on the like 30-40% range. So our expert aggregation was right around where the market was staying at the time, though we had more of a discussion, meaty discussion around it. That's it.
Thank you, Karim. And before we get to the further discussion on the nuclear risks, I actually have a little bit of our interactive exercise for the audience here. I'll open up the polling here on Zoom. And we are very interested to hear what you think, which nuclear risks increased or decreased due to the ongoing war in the Middle East. So let me first open up the poll. And let's have 1 minute, 1 minute and a half to vote. So everyone here should have an opportunity to cast their vote on the nuclear risks that have increased or decreased. And then based on these answers and also based, of course, on speakers' own assessment, we will continue the discussion. Okay, so we have 20 more seconds for those who would like to cast their vote. Please do so. And I'm closing the poll in 10 seconds. Okay, so I'm ending the poll at the moment. End poll. And I'm sharing results. So all of you should see the results on your own screen. Dear speakers, please confirm if you see the results of both polls. So we see actually a very broad variety of risks that have increased, and quite a few of those that think that some of the risks actually decreased with the ongoing developments. At this moment, I would like to start the discussion, and I would like to ask our speakers to also refer to some of the results that you see on the screen, and maybe connect them to your own points on the increased or decreased nuclear risks. So based on the audience and your own assessment, when we talk about nuclear risk in this crisis, what specific risks have increased or decreased? And this is a question to all the speakers. Let me start with Bob, then Şebnem, and then Karim. Bob, the floor is yours.
Xenia. I'm going to focus on whether the current war will increase or decrease the risk that Iran will build a nuclear weapon. There are many risks, and you've cited them in your poll, but that's the one I'm going to focus on. I think that it's the most consequential. So on the one hand, U.S. and Israeli campaign could increase Iran's motivation to acquire nuclear weapons. The scale of the U.S.-Israeli attack and the emphasis on regime change made clear that the Islamic Republic faced an existential threat, and that threat would likely persist indefinitely. Iran's warnings that it would retaliate massively with conventionally armed missiles and drones provided proved inadequate as a deterrent. The lesson for Iran may be that only nuclear weapons can deter and ensure the survival of the regime. Moreover, with the IAEA no longer present in Iran and substantial quantities of highly enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges no longer subject to IAEA safeguards, Iran may see an opportunity to pursue a small covert program to build nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, the campaign could demonstrate to Iran that the path to building nuclear weapons would be very difficult and very risky. The current campaign has further degraded Iran's nuclear options, targeting weaponization sites not hit last June and striking some previously struck facilities, including the Natanz enrichment facility. The deep penetration of Iran by Israeli and U.S. intelligence, as was clearly demonstrated by the killing of the supreme leader, would make it hard for Iran to pursue an undetected covert program. And U.S. and Israeli actions have made it clear that if they detected any covert program or any more overt program of building of rebuilding nuclear or missile capabilities, they would attack again and as often as necessary. And so, from what we know now, I think that on balance, the war has decreased the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran. But that judgment could be affected by such current unknowns as the future leadership of Iran and how the war ends. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Bob, for your insightful take on the Iranian potential weaponization. Şebnem, the floor is yours. What is your assessment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for your very kind introduction, Ksenia, and it's a pleasure being here. I also took a quick look at the answers from the audience, but also from the question that you have asked. I'd like to, first of all, give a generic view of what we are talking about when we say war. And it has its certain stages. And when we talk about weapons and weaponization, there is always a political process behind on whether when we want to have a weapon, there is always a threat assessment behind and a decision. And also states assign a role and a meaning to this type of weapon. And it will be a flawed analysis to consider this as having the same role. I'm talking about nuclear weapons or meaning for any state. Different states can assign different meanings and different roles. First, this one was important. And second, the start of a military operation while negotiations were continuing, in fact, sent the wrong message. And here eroded not only the norm of nuclear non-proliferation, but more importantly, the norms of international relations and diplomacy. And I see that also as a baseline risk for further nuclear risks. It's because it increased the threat perceptions and motivated states to acquire defensive or deterrent military capabilities, if not offensive ones. So the role of nuclear weapons, in fact, should be discussed within this context. And second, I want to talk a little bit about unconditional surrender because one of the stages of the war is the combat stage, and here the parties aim at having victory, and this is going to prepare the conditions for a peace settlement or a negotiation that ends, in fact, the war. So the unconditional surrender was pronounced back in 1943 during World War II between Roosevelt and Churchill, and they decided to demand the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. But it eventually could be achieved because there was the use of nuclear weapons that brought the end of the war. And for today's circumstances, this political aim, if it is the political aim, seems unrealistic considering the capabilities and the resilience of Iran and the limitations of conventional forces of the United States in the region. And the nature of war here dictates that when the parties cannot really win over each other, it causes what we call friction. And to avoid friction, the war has the nature to go to extremes, and parties may apply more destructive power. And if that friction continues, I may see that risk. But as I said, I mean, we hope that it's not going to happen.
Thank you, Şebnem. Karim?
Thank you so much, Ksenia. So just for a change, I'm going to comment on Paul's assessments, which I found fascinating. Try to relate them to also to some of the points that Şebnem and Bob made during their interventions. So it looks like the biggest risk that would increase, at least from the participants' assessment, is the military attack on nuclear facilities. And it also looks that it was seen that it was the least agreed upon risk that would decrease. So really the majority of people see this as the biggest risk that is increased right now, which would cause radiological contamination for that specific question that you posed. Second is the loss of oversight of nuclear materials, and taking that together with what Bob and Şebnem mentioned about how Iran had almost incentive to build some sort of a clandestine nuclear weapon program is just interesting and revealing how we're seeing that this is increasing the risk of weaponization as opposed to decrease it. I found it interesting that also nuclear weapon weaponization as itself is coming at 33%, 37%, which I found quite interesting to unpack, to say the least. Last but not least, the stockpile of HEU transferred to one of Iran's proxies. I don't think we have talked enough about that. But the fact that we know that we have hundreds of kilograms of highly enriched uranium right now in Iran, and we have no visibility on them whatsoever, and given the activation that Iran is doing with regard to its proxies, we've seen on the Hezbollah, but we wouldn't be surprised if we see the Houthis are in the game. I would think that this risk is more pronounced than the current participation suggests. Finally, I'm sorry, I said finally for the last one, but finally, it's just interesting that when you ask people what would you see risk, what risk would you see decreasing? The great majority said none of the above. So most of us don't think that post these strikes any risk actually decreased.
Thank you, Karim, and also thank you for summarizing the poll that we have done. And I think it's also interesting for our audience to see kind of what the people here interested in the topic think about nuclear risks. And I would actually like you, Karim, to build up further and talk a little bit more in detail about the Iran's nuclear trajectory. Since you also mentioned that you're surprised about seeing the Iranian nuclear weaponization risk being at 37%, so it's kind of connected to the next question as well. So what does this escalation mean for Iran's nuclear trajectory and internal political dynamics, including the possibility of the regime stability or leadership change? Could you address this one?
So I think many experts and most of the experts here already know that Iran's main narrative around nuclear issues centers around the right of enrich and the right to develop the civilian nuclear program, with a fatwa that was actually issued by Ali Khamenei, who was assassinated last week, that producing a nuclear weapon is not allowed under Sharia law. Now we have a new supreme leader, and they do not really have to agree with any previous fatwas. And also now they have seen that the whole narrative built around the right to enrich and the right to basically be a threshold state with the capability to build the weapon, whether they wanted to or not, hasn't paid off. I think they could make a very eloquent case about the fact that the NPT had not served them installations that were under safeguards. And I think this was also touched upon with other of our speakers. Also, I have to say, and I'm going to try to articulate this as politely as possible, but I think there are some Armageddon-driven narratives that be, just so I don't single out Iran, Israel's conversations about the greater Israel from Euphrates to the Nile, followed by also some reports that we've seen of some American troops being sent notifications that this is part of Armageddon. What we're doing right here is part of bringing this prophecy about. And then third, we have the Iranian case of basically bringing the Imam who disappeared 700, 800 years ago back, and we're going to be basically pushing for apocalyptic scenarios in order for this to come about. So all these taken together, and I think the nuclear explosion is the most vivid image, or the closest image to Armageddon that humanity has ever been closer to. So I see some sort of a mirroring between that image of a nuclear explosion and about some apocalyptic vision. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Karim. Would you like to comment about the ONN forecasts on the Iranian regime change, just slightly? And for the context, this is one of the forecasts we ran with our ONN expert roster very recently.
True. So yes, last week, it's crazy to say, it's been like 10 days ago, we did have the forecast about regime change, which came at about 30% aggregate. I think if we run this forecast again, it would be very different. That was before the strike. And as a matter of fact, when we ask our experts in our forecasting exercise what would change that forecast or make it higher, the number one cited issue was whether the strikes were going to be renewed on Iran. Now it looks like the regime is consolidating. I think Mujtaba Khamenei's election looks like that the regime is really persevering. Not to say that I don't see scenarios where the regime could change, but I'm saying for the time being, it's interesting to see how the trajectory is going to look like.
Thank you, Karim. And we also, for the audience here, we're going to also rerun this forecast in our future loop cycles. And if you're interested to join our ONN expert roster, in the chat, you will find a link where you can apply and join our forecasting community and actually contribute to forecasting of those questions in the future. So now I would like to switch back also to our different other panelists, and Bob and Şebnem. I have a kind of very big question to both of you, but let's try to unpack it within a very limited time we have. So what are the implications for nuclear diplomacy and the broader non-proliferation regime? I think, Şebnem, you already started touching on that. So could you please start us off? And then, Bob, you will go next.
Thank you very much. I rather go with the theory first and go into the practice so that everything is going to fit into its place. When we actually talk about international law and norms, they did not come about all in suddenly. They developed through time and learning from experience. And the goal has been to prevent wars which were likely in a realist world. And especially that was particularly after 2 world wars. And this conflict, the current conflict, had been going on actually in the mind with varying intensity. And diplomacy is actually is the art of dealing with it without using force, but still with the backing of some kind of power. So the implication is that it, as I mentioned in the previous section, sent the wrong message to non-nuclear weapon states for their status, because the nuclear non-proliferation regime has mainly developed its 2 norms very strongly: nuclear non-proliferation and peaceful use of nuclear energy. And especially after the end of the Cold War, the nuclear non-proliferation norm and being a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT has become a security asset rather than a security deficit. But this event has sent this wrong message that it is eroding, the norm is eroding, and this asset is going towards being a deficit. So that's why it also runs the risk of attributing nuclear weapons the role of a single deterrent capability. That's the main issue here. And this is going to have its impact on the non-proliferation regime. And then it's also about the utility of war. We have constructed a world that is based on interdependence, economic connectivity, and also role of diplomacy fits in there, with international law, international institutions as a platform to come about and to discuss, so that we are aiming to decrease the risk of the conflict and threat perceptions. If threat perception is high, then a mobilization and the motive to have more weapons increase. So we are actually, interestingly, moving from the liberal zone of security, which we constructed for a long time, back to the realist zone of security, which is the point where we started. This is actually the problem, and we're not staying on a sound ground right now.
Thank you, Şebnem. Bob?
Looking at prospects for nuclear diplomacy and proliferation in the region, it's a very important subject, and I would say that immediate prospects for nuclear diplomacy are not very good. The Trump administration says that it attacked Iran after concluding that the Iranians were not serious about negotiations. President Trump says there'll be no deal with Iran except there would be no deal unless Iran agreed to unconditional surrender. For the Iranian part, they say the U.S. has twice used negotiations as a ruse to conceal its intention to attack. The new supreme leader's father often railed against negotiations with the United States, saying that Americans simply can't be trusted. So near-term prospects aren't very good at all. But still, both sides have at times expressed a willingness to talk. Since the strikes began on February 28th, President Trump had talked about his interest in talks. Ari Larijani, the head of the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, briefly talked about talks, but then backed off of that. But I think it's possible that eventually, and perhaps in the context of talks about a ceasefire or ending the conflict, talks could take place. And in such talks, I believe that the nuclear issue would figure prominently. Now, the last round of talks in Geneva, 2 days before the attacks, after that brief round of talks, the Omani foreign minister, who's the mediator between the two sides, indicated that significant progress had been made. But still, the two sides remain far apart. On the nuclear issue, the central disagreement, and Karim mentioned this, is on enrichment, with the United States calling for the complete abandonment of Iran's enrichment program. Iran is prepared to accept some constraints on enrichment, including a temporary suspension of enrichment, perhaps for several years. And it's also apparently prepared to blend down its stocks of highly enriched uranium. But zero enrichment appears to have crossed Iran's red line. And of course, beyond the nuclear issue, the Trump administration is calling for restricting Iran's missile program and ending support for its regional proxies. Iran, for its part, insists on handling those issues separately and in the context of discussions that also involve states of the region. It's possible to imagine, in my view, it's possible to imagine a compromise that would permanently allow Iran to retain only a small and rigorously verified enrichment program capable of meeting only modest civil needs, such as medical isotope production. An agreement along those lines could provide confidence, in my view, that Iran could not produce nuclear weapons, and it would reduce incentives for countries like Saudi Arabia to pursue their own nuclear weapons programs. But such a compromise, as attractive as it is, to me at least, may be politically unacceptable in Washington and Tehran. And in the absence of agreement, uncertainty about a future Iranian nuclear weapons capability will persist, and that will increase incentives for Riyadh and perhaps others to keep their nuclear weapons options open. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob, for this very comprehensive answer. And I think we already started to touch upon our next question, actually, with the scenarios. So now I have a question to all of you. And this is about kind of looking ahead, like what's going to happen. And I think Bob already very eloquently started this discussion off. So looking 6 to 12 months ahead, what are the 2 or 3 most plausible scenarios that follow from the escalation that is happening now? And what is a plausible scenario that increases nuclear risk and what is a plausible scenario that decreases nuclear risk? Of course, in your response, we're also very interested, is there a scenario that might lead to nuclear weapons use, which is the highest, I guess, nuclear weapon risk that the humanity knows. In this round, I would like to start with Karim. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to be brief with this because I actually want to also address the last question as well. So I see three scenarios. One is war spillover. That means to other regional parties more than the ones that we have right now, or even great power entry into it. We know that energy is going to be the biggest pressure point. So whether whether China, for instance, would respond in any means, that be through support or whatnot, is a dimension to be considered, and also other regional parties. Second scenario would be stopping the strikes because the US and Israel feel that their objectives have been met, and then Trump declaring that this was a victory, which he's good at doing, stopping things or doing things in whichever direction, and then stating that this was victorious. And then last, we can have an official ceasefire, some sort of a brokering deal. And these are all in the short term, like you said, brokering deal to basically stop the current fights and get us into the shore of safety. So on that point, if we go through that third one, I remember during the JCPOA negotiations in 2015, we would, as an Egyptian, would try to insert the issue of the WMD-free zone to our Iranian colleagues, and they would tell us we don't have time to talk about unicorns. I think now we do have some time to talk about the unicorn. And I don't think it's out of reach to start thinking that now that Egypt is not an existential threat, Syria is not anymore, and Iran, assuming its nuclear weapon has already been diffused, then we should start thinking about regionalizing it. I also think it offers a face-saving mechanism for Iran, say that we're going to talk about making a regional nuclear disarmament. Israel also needs to come to the table and say, okay, after we've done such and such, we are now ready to talk about multilateralism and making sustainable security arrangements, which we eventually need in the region. And also we can talk about the regional nuclear fuel cycle, which the late Mohammed Shakir was advocating, which would also provide another face-saving mechanism since Iran's red line is zero enrichment, like Bob. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. Şebnem, what about your scenarios?
In fact, Senya, when you asked the question about nuclear risk, I could cite four. First is nuclear weapon use, which is not likely. Second is Iran's weaponization of the HU, which is not likely under these circumstances. And the rest of the two, actually, I wrote and you asked to the audience: loss of control over HU stockpiles and acquisition by non-state actors, which is like a post-Soviet scenario, and this could be possible. And the fourth one is attacks to nuclear facilities with a nuclear safety consequence, which is the release of radioactive material. And this is likely. Well, and I also thought what would increase the first risk, as I mentioned in the previous section, it is insistence on unconditional surrender, if that's what they need. And Iran's defeat in the war could result in the loss of control over HU. And there has already been attacks to these nuclear facilities. And so far, the IAEA stated that there was no radiological risk at the time. And for the recent one, its evaluation is expected. And for my part, what I see as a plausible scenario that would decrease that risk, that is negotiation. And I would like to take some time on that. And looking at the chat also, I was going to mention the JCPOA. Obviously, we cannot pass without it. For negotiation to take place, first of all, there should be a ceasefire, although what we're having was not declared officially as a war. So under the curtain of military operation, a negotiation is hard to take place. And also, I think the United States has lost its credibility for a negotiation and a settlement for a JCPOA-like agreement. At the same time, the involved parties against Iran, their political goals for the war have been different, but still had a common goal. That was from the intention side of the threat, which is if you cannot change the capabilities right now, you need to change the intentions. So you need to change how the actor thinks who is going to decide. And that was thought perhaps of something like a Venezuelan model, but obviously it didn't work. And for the political aims of the war, these are right now unclear. And we have to consider the sociological and historical realities of the country. And in fact, for the negotiation process itself, I think this is very important sociologically at this part of the world, because during the process that led to the JCPOA, I was following the discourse of Iranian officials, and there was a message that they were trying to give. And they said, maybe not openly, we want to be treated as equal. So until that could happen, you couldn't really break the lock. So Iran wants to be acknowledged that it's a sovereign country that is going to be treated equally, and that its nuclear program is not just a technical thing. It has invested a lot, and it sees it as a pride, as a national pride. So when you say like you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that, or you can just do this, there is a resistance. So the first point in the negotiation is to understand the other party and their resistance points and find the ways that you can break it and find a common ground. So for it also a negotiation to take place, both parties need to feel that they have to come to the table. And in conflict resolution, it is called that the conflict should be ripe. I think we need to arrive at this point.
Thank you, Şebnem, for a very comprehensive overview of potential scenario. Bob, would you like to add something? You already kind of started to talk about potential scenarios, but maybe something to add to your points. Bob, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah,
Thank you.
The host muted me, so
I know there was a problem with the noise. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'd like to mention three possible scenarios. The first is that the opposition succeeds in toppling the current clerical military regime and replacing it with a largely secular government responsive to the needs of the Iranian people. Under this scenario, the new government abandons enrichment and other weapons-related activities, sharply curtails missile capabilities, welcomes international inspectors, terminates support for the destabilizing activities of non-state regional actors, and ends repression at home. Now, clearly, this is the best scenario for reducing nuclear risks, but it's the least likely. The second scenario is that the current hardline regime survives the war, but that pragmatists in the regime succeed in making the case that given the Islamic Republic's military weakness and desperate economic situation, its survival depends on negotiating a deal with the United States. Under this scenario, a deal is reached with the Trump administration that permanently permits Iran to have only a very modest enrichment program, restores IAEA safeguards, restricts the range of Iran's missiles, bans the transfer of military equipment and technology to regional non-state actors, and provides significant sanctions relief and perhaps also opportunities for U.S.-Iranian trade and investment, which might appeal to the Trump administration. But the deal is silent on Iranian internal matters. The second scenario is more plausible than the first and would significantly reduce nuclear risks. But prospects for reaching such a deal between the Trump administration and the current Iranian regime is not very high, in my view. The third scenario is that the hardline regime survives, and that either no negotiations take place between the U.S. and Iran, or that they take place but eventually break down over fundamental differences. Under this scenario, the IAEA continues to be excluded from Iran. Iranian leaders remain committed to rebuilding their nuclear and missile programs. Internal debate in Iran intensifies about the need to build nuclear weapons, and the U.S. and the United States and Israel declare their readiness to resume military attacks as often as necessary to prevent Iran from reconstituting threatening nuclear and missile activities. This scenario is a recipe for mutual suspicions, heightened tensions, regional proliferation pressures, and a constant cat and mouse game that could result in recurring waves of armed conflict. It is this scenario that most increases nuclear risk, and unfortunately, may be the most plausible of the three. You asked also, Ksenia, I believe, that are there realistic scenarios that could result in nuclear use? I don't think so. The United States and Israel have no need to use nuclear weapons. They are demonstrating that their overwhelming conventional superiority gives them whatever they need to achieve their military objectives. And of course, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons to respond to US and Israeli attacks, and Russia and China seem unwilling to be directly involved in the current war and would certainly not be willing to intervene with nuclear weapons on Iran's behalf. So that's my attitude toward the scenarios.
Thank you, Bob. I will leave my last question to you for the end of the webinar for kind of a shorter response on the nuclear risk reduction measures. And now I want to turn to the audience questions so we can cover some of them before the end of the webinar. I will say the question, and then anyone who wants to reply, just please go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead. So the first question we have here is, how would you assess the risks of other nations concluding that only by having nuclear weapons can they avoid being attacked? Referring to the DPRK situation. Who would like to take this one?
I think I can take it because I just
Sure.
set the background up for that one. That's exactly what I was trying to say in the beginning. When you, it matters so much when in the decision-making process, what type of weapon you want and why. This is a political process. So if you build up or if you give the message with your deeds that this is your only way for survival, then they're going to acquire that meaning. But the international nuclear non-proliferation regime is that precious that it built the opposite for a long time. And that is why I think it is so important that the rest of the states are going to come to the conclusion that it is so essential to keep the norm of non-proliferation and work towards that, because the outliers are not the right ones. Wrong does not make, examples of wrong does not make it right. That's the huge problem. And I think the IAEA and the DG Grossi has also a role to play in that, because when we're speaking by referring to technical processes and see how we can technically reduce the political risk, that is going to unlock the process, because this is exactly what happened during the JCPOA negotiation process. Both parties were really talking about technological processes and they could come to an agreement. If you take up the distrust between the two countries and your historical and background and your traumas, etc., you cannot break anything here. And then whatever kind of weapon system serves to your interest, you set your eye on it, and that's the problem.
Thank you, Şebnem. Bob?
Yeah, if I could just add, if I could just add, having nuclear weapons is not the only way to avoid being attacked. Another very important way of avoiding attack is to establish security relationships with a nuclear power that's prepared to provide security assurances, to extend nuclear deterrence to you. And this has been a very effective way of avoiding attack for many American allies in Europe and in East Asia. In fact, seeking nuclear weapons, being in the process of pursuing nuclear weapons, can very much undermine the security of a non-nuclear state. If in the early stages of a nuclear weapons program, the pursuer of nuclear weapons can be very, very vulnerable to preemptive attack. And this may not be seeking nuclear weapons may not be the best way to guarantee your security.
Thank you, Bob. In the interest of time, we'll jump to the next question, and I would like to ask you to be a bit briefer so we can address at least a few before we end up this session. So the next question is, do you think Iran withdrawing from the NPT a likely option, as they could invoke the fact that the war is an extraordinary event that has jeopardized the supreme interest per Article 10 of the NPT?
If I may put on my foresight and prediction specialist, we actually did ask this question to our forecasting crew before the expert poster joined us, so just ONN staff and friends, and we forecasted the aggregate that's at 15% likely that Iran would be issuing withdrawal notification by April 27, 2026. That's because at the time we assessed that this is out of Iran's narrative and strategy negotiating wise. I would think we're still at 15% if we ask this question again, not because of this reason, but because this move seems a bit too small right now for them.
Thank you, Karim. Bob, Şebnem, do you want to add anything? Yeah.
I just mentioned taking concrete steps to pursue nuclear weapons, especially detectable concrete steps, can be very damaging to your security. Iran could well be the victim of another wave of military preemptive attacks. But withdrawal, announcing your intention to withdraw, it would be a provocative step. But it's unlikely to lead to preemptive attacks. It's a procedure. It's a 90-day procedure. You express your intention to withdraw within 90 days, and it's an opportunity to negotiate and to alleviate some of the conditions that drove Iran to talk about withdrawal. So I would give the likelihood of Iran declaring its intention to withdraw as much more likely than it pursuing concrete steps to acquire nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bob. Let's move to the next question. So Mark Goodman is writing, I haven't heard anyone address the danger of state failure in Iran, not a replacement of the current regime by a better or worse one, but a loss of the central authority and a period of civil instability or unrest. How likely is this, and what are the dangers, I guess, in regards to the nuclear risks, especially? Who would like to take this one? Şebnem?
I'm not an expert on Iranian domestic politics, but I think the point of the question is quite right, because when you start a war and you're basically trembling, starting this trembling in the fault lines, you should have known what it's going to end with. And the main issue I also witnessed, I was in the United States prior to 2003 Iraq operation, and I catch a similar discourse here. And later on, when I was studying for my PhD dissertation as well, I read the book The American Way of War, dated 1973. And here, the United States tends to take on the war of annihilation rather than a war of attrition. So having strategically superior weapons, they think that it's going to prepare the conditions for the peace settlement. But the main problem here is that the domestic conditions and the constituents of the society are quite disregarded for what can happen afterwards. And I see it both ways, for both the nuclear risk and also for regional security risks in general, because it's having its own extensions in the region. So as long as Iran is seeing this war as a war of attrition, that's going to create friction in the war. And when friction happens, the point that the participant has mentioned has the likelihood to increase. And the intended destruction is not going to really happen in Iran, because this country has the past of being a civilization, and they have their national pride. And so it's not going to perhaps break into pieces, but rather gather around the administration, even if they don't like it. So these are the scenarios there, and it may increase their intention to have a deterrent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Şebnem. Bob?
I'll be brief, but I feel obliged to respond to Mark, who's a former colleague of mine at the State Department. At this stage, Mark, I think the likelihood of a breakdown of authority and control over Iranian nuclear installations and materials is very low. I mean, authorities seem to be in charge. They seem to have protected these facilities and materials quite conscientiously. But of course, the consequences for any breakdown could be severe. I mean, we had this concern with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and these cooperative threat reduction programs were able to minimize those risks substantially. Having such a cooperative program with Iran seems much less likely, but the consequences could be severe.
Thank you, Bob. Since we're out of time, I just would like to close us this webinar with the last question that we prepared for you. And if you can respond to it very kind of briefly, maybe in a couple of sentences to sum up your response, that would be very much appreciated. So what concrete steps would most effectively reduce nuclear risk in the near term? Karim, you're first.
Yeah, I already put one on the table. Think about the long term, think about engagement, and think about face-saving mechanisms. Lean a lot on regional mediators who have a stake in the game: Egypt, Oman, Turkey, and then great powers as well.
Thank you, Karim. Şebnem?
I totally agree with Karim, and just want to underline the face-saving options, because this can only happen with, probably it's going on with backdoor diplomacy. And to go back to the down the escalation ladder, it's so important to have this kind of exchange and find the face-saving option to find a settlement for both sides.
Thank you, Şebnem. And Bob?
Most important near-term step would be the restoration of IAEA activities in Iran. and in particular, having some kind of joint IAEA-Iran cooperation in returning all Iranian highly enriched uranium and advanced centrifuges to IAEA accountancy. This should not be too difficult. I mean, Iran might seek some kind of a compensation for doing this. But after all, restoring IAEA safeguards in Iran is an obligation that Iran has under the NPT, and hopefully it could be persuaded to take this step.
Thank you, Bob. So with this more kind of forward-looking and recommendation-based ending, we will finish today's session. I would like to thank our speakers today, Şebnem, Bob, Karim, for taking your time and sharing your expertise and experience with all these issues. I'm sure our audience gained a lot of insights. I certainly did, and learned a lot of new things. We would be uploading this webinar on ONN YouTube channel, so if you want to come back to it, rewatch it, or take up some points, please go ahead and check our YouTube channel tomorrow. I'm sure it will be there already, and we will be posting a little summary there as well afterwards on our website. Remember, nuclear risks matter, and please join us for the future So What webinars that we at ONN organize, and we will be happy to see you there. Thank you again for your time, and till the next time.